So, how's it going so far? Don't worry too much if you're struggling with this one, I have thrown you in the deep end here. So let's give you a hand, shall we? The way this hint video is going to work is that I'm going to start working on my tank movement script and walk you through detecting the input from each player. Once I've set that up, I'm going to hand the reins back over to you for you to finish the script. Sound good? Okay, let's get started then. Okay, so to start, we're going to add a new audio source component to our tank prefab. We'll be using this to play our tank engine sounds through. Now we already have an audio source component attached to the tank prefab, which we're using to play the tank shooting sounds. So we don't want to use that for these engine sounds, as you can only play one WAV file through an audio source at a time. Imagine if we were playing our engine idle sound through it, and as soon as a player decided to shoot, the engine sound would stop and be replaced by a cannon shot sound, which is not what we want. So let's quickly add our new audio source. Next, let's jump into the tank movement script and look at editing it to play our sounds. Now inside this script, there are some variables that were created by the developers of tanks that can help us out. Those variables are m_movement axis name and m_turn axis name, m movement input value, and m turn input value. If we read the comments next to these variables, we can see that the first two are string variables that are going to be used to hold the name of the input axes that read the player's movement input. The second two are float variables, which will be used to hold the value of those axes. Let's click on the m_movement axes name variable to highlight it and see when it is used in this script. Now, if we slowly scroll down, we then see it's first used in the start and update functions. In the start function, we can see that the developers are storing the names of the movement axes we looked at inside of these variables, but the way they've done it is really interesting. As we know, the axes called vertical 1 and horizontal 1 are used to detect input from player 1, whereas the axes called vertical 2 and horizontal 2 are used to detect input from player 2. However, instead of writing any of those, the developers of this script have combined the words vertical and horizontal with a variable called mPlayerNumber. Now if we click on the mPlayerNumber variable and then scroll to the top of the script, we can read the comment next to where it was declared that reads, used to identify which tank belongs to which player. This is set by the tank's manager. Now that manager that they are referring to is another script that exists on a game object called Game Manager, and it handles tasks such as spawning tanks, counting the rounds, and assigning a number to each tank spawned. So for player 1, the m_player name variable will be 1, and for player 2, the variable will hold the number 2. Now I know this because this is a public variable, so all I had to do was play the game, click on a tank, take a look at the m_player number field on the tank movement component in the inspector tab of Unity. Alternatively, you could use the debug.log function, which we've looked at before. Okay, great. So we have these variables that are holding the names of all of the axes we're interested in, but why are they important? Well, earlier I explained to you how we could check for player input and then use that to play and manipulate our sounds. However, in this scenario of adding engine sounds to our tanks, we need to take into account the fact that we are using one script shared across two instances of the completed tank prefab. Let's say that we wrote something like this. If input.getAxis horizontal 1 doesn't equal 0, and input.getAxis vertical 1 doesn't equal 0, then play the engine driving sound. The driving sound would then play when player 1 moves their tank. Okay, that's fine, but because this script is attached to both tanks, that means that if player 1 presses, say, the W key to move forward, both tanks would then play the driving sound. So we have a problem, because whilst player 1 would be moving, player 2 would not. Now we can't just add the same code but change the axis names to horizontal and vertical too, because we'd have the same problem except for both tanks. If player 1 moves and 2 doesn't, both tanks would play the driving sound, and likewise, if player 2 moves and 1 doesn't, again, both tanks would play the driving sound. So how do we fix this issue? Well, this is where those variables I mentioned earlier come in handy. Thanks to the Tank Manager script that assigned separate numbers to the player number variable for each instance of our tank movement script, we have variables that can access the axes for both player 1 and player 2. For the instance of our script attached to player 1's tank, the variables m_movement axis name and m_turn axis name are holding strings that read horizontal 1 and vertical 1. And for the instance of our script attached to player 2's tank, those instances of our variables are holding strings that read horizontal 2 and vertical 2. This was done using appending strings, which is where we use the plus operator to combine two separate pieces of string data, or in this case string data with an integer, turning it into string data, to make a new string. And we've done this before within the debug.log function in order to create dynamic messages to help us test our code. So using the m_movement axis name and m_turn axis name variables, the developers of our tank movement script are able to check each frame the values of the axes that they are referencing to see if and when players 1 and 2 try to move the tanks, and store the values inside of the m_movement input value and m_turn input value variables. So if we check these variables for values between -1 and 1, we can tell each tank to play our engine sounds when they move independently of the other. So with all of this in mind, how would I start my script? Well, first I'm going to create a new function which I'll use to control my audio, and I'll call it engine audio. I'll then call it inside of the update function so that it runs on every frame. Of course, I could just write my code in the update function directly, but for the sake of organization, I'll use my new function. Next comes an if statement. Now inside the brackets, I'm going to write m_movement input value is equal to 0 and m_turn value is also equal to 0. So what I'm doing is checking for two values. I'm checking to see if the horizontal and vertical axes for either player are 0, or in other words, if neither player is pressing their movement keys. Remember, if they were, the values of the horizontal and vertical axes would be anything other than 0. So if these conditions are met, then our players are not moving. So using it, we want to tell our engine idle audio file to play. For now, I'm just going to make a note to remind me of that later. I'm also going to start an else statement underneath my if statement. Now we know that else statements trigger if the conditions within the above if statements were not met. So in other words, if either the horizontal or vertical axes for either player do not equal 0, then this else statement will be triggered. This would also mean that a player is moving. So this statement is where we'll want to tell our engine driving sound to play. Sadly, however, I won't be showing you how to do anything else in this video. But hey, now that we've made a start together on our script, let's see what you can do on your own. Remember, we want to switch between the two audio files and play them. Give it a go, see how you get on, and then meet me over in the final video.